In the past 4 centuries, the English language has gone from a minor Germanic language on an island in northern Europe to the world's most prestigious and widespread tongue. And with that has also seen the precipitous spread of English culture, ancestry, and political institutions. English was, of course, influenced by a multitude of different languages and culture throughout its development, and this has been mirrored by its spread and evolution across many different continents. Although Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand were all formerly British colonies with an English-derived ruling class, this quickly expanded to include Celtic minorities such as the Irish, Scottish, Welsh, and Cornish, the latter of which you could argue is already nearly completely assimilated into the dominant English culture in their homeland. And this ruling class was expanded in their overseas colonies to include other Northwest Europeans as they arrived in massive numbers throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, gradually assimilating into the Anglophone cultures of these countries that were very, very far away from home. And as a result, pretty much all of us now speak their rather unusual language. We may occasionally make fun of each other and trade spots as the world's punching bag, but there's so many descendants of the British and Irish in America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and such a sufficient period of intermixing and cultural exchange that we all consider ourselves more or less cousins or even brother nations on the world stage, even if we hate to admit it. Similar to how Hispanics and Latinos of many different races and nationalities come together under a larger Pan-Ethnicity on the world stage. So therefore I would say that Anglos, aka Anglo-Saxons, are all a part of a wider pan-ethnic group that is of course split into various smaller ethnic subgroups, just as they are in Latin America. Now, of course, I'm not saying that the previous ancestries and ethnic identities of English speakers in Anglophone countries are somehow irrelevant and don't have an impact in the present day, but merely that they are subsumed and integrated with larger modern identities, just like how the Spanish-speaking nations have a common Hispanic heritage and identify or group together loosely. This is also similar to the Portuguese-speaking or Lusophone world and the French-speaking or Francophone world, as these regions also retain a certain sense of historical and cultural connection. These are the colonial legacies of these once massive empires. How interconnected are the countries of the Anglosphere? Comparatively, very much so, arguably much more than Hispanic countries, as the United Kingdom still has a far greater political and cultural influence on their former overseas colonies than Spain does, and the United States has a greater impact on modern Britain than Hispanic America has on Spain, being particularly fueled and accelerated by the internet, which gives the Anglophone countries a feeling of camaraderie and closeness despite being scattered all over the world, making them the modern core component of the Western world. No other global civilization shares a common heritage, socio-political outlook, and vision for the future to the same extent as the Anglosphere. And if you don't believe me, just see why Canadians, Brits, and Australians have such a vested interest in American politics and pop culture, and vice versa, seen an American interest in the British royal family. Although admittedly, Americans are generally far less interested in British or Canadian politics than the reverse. Judging by a poll I conducted, it seems that my audience is very split on the social trajectory of the Anglosphere countries in the near future, with similar numbers predicting that the cultures of these countries will continue to converge or diverge in the 21st century, and I can see arguments for each side. One could argue that due to the mass migration of diverse groups into these nations, their culture and heritage will be directed away from their original Anglophone roots. However, assimilation rates of many immigrants with the majority population is quite high. For instance, white Hispanics have a very high intermarriage rate with non-white Hispanics in North America, with over half of second-generation white Hispanics marrying into the non-Hispanic white community, although intermarriage rates for black Hispanics into the non-Hispanic black American population is significantly lower. These trends make it more and more difficult to draw distinct lines between various ethnic and racial groups in these countries. However, these emerging demographic phenomena are far more complicated and dynamic than most people understand or could predict, as the English language and British heritage serves as a glue to bind these nations together. You can also see the connection and deeply shared roots between many individuals from Anglo cultures when viewing these communities from abroad, as in many different foreign environments in Asia, Africa, Europe, and Latin America, Anglos of different backgrounds and nationalities will intentionally or unintentionally stick together and form insular communities to an extent, due to their common language, political, and religious outlooks, and to maintain a connection back to their homelands, which comparatively don't seem all too different from each other when immersed into entirely alien environments. Am I saying that all Anglophone peoples and cultures are exactly the same? No, obviously not. Just as Hispanic countries are not the same, not by a long shot. But the ethnic and cultural similarities between them become far more obvious when zoomed out on a global scale. The vast majority of leaders from the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand have had some degree of English or other British heritage, and a number of British leaders have even had US-American ancestry, as there has been a significant degree of migration between these nations, solidifying their bonds for the past several hundred years. The Anglophone nations of the Caribbean, known as the West Indies, are more of a unique case. After the decimation of the native Taino tribes, many of the islands of the West Indies, such as Barbados, Bermuda, St. Kitts, and the Bahamas, were originally settled by Europeans, especially Irish indentured servants, who were not always brought willingly. This period didn't last long, however, as the British soon began importing thousands of slaves from West Central Africa, creating a new demographic makeup of these islands, as the bulk of the impoverished Irish population of the West Indies departed for Britain's North American colonies. A very large portion of European settlers in America's southern states, such as the Carolinas, Georgia, Florida, and Virginia, have roots from some of these early West Indian settlers, although they have entirely assimilated with other Anglophone communities, and there has always been a large degree of intermigration between the Anglophone countries, as all of these countries, except the United States, are a part of the Commonwealth of Nations, although there is still visa-free travel between the US and the rest of the Anglosphere. There are instances of groups or individuals from the British Isles settling in various European countries for centuries, including regions as diverse as Poland, Russia, or France. After all, this is obvious from the Breton ethnic group in the Brittany Peninsula, a Celtic people who settled in mainland Europe around 1500 years ago. And although they have maintained their Celtic identity, a majority of the population has assimilated with the French culturally and linguistically in the present day. The modern Anglophone diaspora in Europe is partially a product of British colonialism in the Mediterranean, as well as more recent migrants from all over the Anglosphere, with some of the largest diasporas now being located mostly in Western European countries such as Germany, Switzerland, Italy, France, Spain, and Portugal, who have all arrived at various points in time and for various reasons, many of whom work for the US and UK armed forces on military bases all over NATO countries. As of 2024, there are around 2 to 3 million Anglos living in mainland Europe, with the largest proportion living throughout the Mediterranean, such as Gibraltar and Malta, where Anglos are around 10% of the population, as well as Cyprus, the Balearic Islands, southern France, the coastal regions of Turkey, Israel, the Canary Islands, and the Azores and Madeira Islands in Portugal. Additionally, Europe has one of the highest degrees of English proficiency as a second language out of any continent, effectively acting as the lingua franca of Northern Europe. Another region with a large Anglophone population of more recent origins is in the Gulf Arab states, with 500,000 to 1 million Anglophones living mainly in private communities throughout the UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Oman, essentially creating a collection of English-speaking enclaves in the Arabian Peninsula that are integrated with the locals and other expats to varying degrees. There are other Anglo communities scattered across Asia, some of which are centuries old, including the Anglo-Indians and other Eurasians in Malaysia, Singapore, and Hong Kong, and in addition there is also a growing number of native English speakers from other local ethnicities, with Singapore arguably being one of the only true Anglophone countries in Asia, as although English is only one of 4 official languages of the small island nation, it is by far viewed as the most prestigious. This is a similar situation to many Pacific Island nations such as Fiji, the Solomon Islands, and Papua New Guinea, where English is used as an administrative language due to the extremely high degree of native linguistic diversity, which makes establishing an indigenous lingua franca nationwide incredibly difficult. In East Asian countries such as Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea, there are a growing number of Anglophone expats, and formerly in the PRC as well, although following 2020, the vast majority of Anglos departed from mainland China, either at the behest of the governments of their home nations or due to the increasingly hostile policies and cultural attitudes perpetuated by the Chinese government against foreigners, especially those from the Western world. In Africa, due to the legacy of the former British Empire and growing connections to the wider world, again greatly bolstered by the spread of the internet, the number of English speakers has exploded, especially in regions that lack a widespread indigenous lingua franca, such as in Western and Southern Africa. There are now more total English speakers in sub-Saharan Africa than there are in the United States, concentrated in Nigeria, Ghana, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, where there are also a number of English-based Creoles and Pidgins that formed over centuries due to contact originally made from the transatlantic slave trade. Language is an incredibly contentious issue in some of these countries, such as in Cameroon, where the small western portion near Nigeria was originally a British colony, while the rest was a French colony. Although this region of Cameroon, referred to by locals as Ambazonia, did indeed vote to be integrated with the rest of Cameroon during a UN plebiscite in 1961, many soon came to regret this decision, leading to an ongoing separatist conflict in the region between Anglophone and Francophone Cameroonians. This goes beyond just a simple linguistic dispute, as the culture imparted by the British is very distinct from that of Francophone Africa, tied to both their religion, political, economic, educational, and judicial systems, making integration between these regions quite difficult. In Latin America, there are hundreds of thousands of West Indian descendants throughout the coastal regions of Central America, parts of Mexico such as Veracruz and Yucatan, Venezuela, the Dominican Republic, and Cuba, most of whom have integrated with and assimilated into the local Hispanic population to varying degrees. More recently, there has been an influx of other Anglophones from the US, Canada, and the UK, and areas like the Bay Islands, where they make up 10 to 20% of the island's population, and in Costa Rica, Panama, and Mexico, which has around 1 to 2 million US citizens, although the bulk of these are Spanish-speaking Mexican Americans who may or may not speak English as their primary language. But Anglophone communities are growing increasingly large in Tijuana, Cabo San Lucas, Jalisco, Mexico City, Oaxaca, Veracruz, Cozumel, and other touristy regions of the country. Several million individuals throughout Latin America have some degree of ancestry from the British Isles during the period of heavy European migration in the 19th and 20th centuries, particularly in the southern cone, including Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay. But the vast majority of their descendants no longer speak English natively and have more or less assimilated with the dominant Hispanic population. There are now 1.5 billion people worldwide who speak English fluently as either a first or second language, nearly 20% of the human population as of 2024. And although it is not the most widespread language spoken percentage-wise in all of history, as a larger proportion of the world spoke Chinese in the past, it is currently the most widely spoken language today and has proliferated to every continent and nearly every nation. Whether these emerging Anglophone countries around the world will integrate with the core Anglosphere to a greater degree remains to be seen. Perhaps it will just be a passing trend and they will return to their original local languages, or maybe they will evolve into something separate and unique altogether in the 21st century. It does seem that the English language is spreading at a rapid pace, not only in the former British colonies, but in countries all over the world to an extent. This has been a cause for alarm among many native groups who do not wish to see their local languages and cultures subsumed into the wider global pan-Anglophone identity, which is also evolving rapidly as it interacts with and absorbs elements from people groups all over the world. And conversely, there are many in the core Anglophone countries that do not wish to see their own cultures diluted or potentially washed away in a sea of global influence. So let me know your thoughts on the global Anglophone community and the Anglosphere, and whether you think it is accurate to group them together under a larger pan-ethnic identity, and what you think is in store for them in the near future as they continue to evolve and interact with each other in the whole world. Thank you all so much for watching. This has been Mason. I'll see you next time.